The jungle never slept, and neither did Private Daniel Kovacs. It was October 1944, and firebase Delta sat like a wound in the green hell of New Guinea, a small American outpost carved from vegetation so thick that sunlight reached the ground only in scattered fragments. Kovacs crouched in the perimeter trench at 0200 hours, listening to the symphony of night sounds that had become both familiar and eternally threatening. Somewhere in the darkness, insects screamed their mating calls. Nocturnal birds shrieked warnings, and beneath it all ran an undercurrent of rustling that could be wind through leaves or could be something far more dangerous. The firebase housed barely 60 men, a reinforced platoon tasked with holding a strategic junction where 3 trails converged, and every single one of them knew they were dangerously exposed. Japanese forces controlled most of the surrounding territory, and intelligence suggested that elite infiltration teams were probing American positions, looking for weak points to exploit. Kovacs had been in New Guinea for 4 months, long enough to lose the naive optimism that had carried him through basic training, but not long enough to become numb to the constant fear. He was 19 years old, a farm kid from Iowa who had grown up fixing tractors and stringing barbed wire fences, skills that seemed laughably irrelevant to jungle warfare until they suddenly were not. Back home, his father had taught him that every problem had a solution if you were willing to think creatively and work with what you had available. It was practical wisdom born of Depression-era necessity, the kind of thinking that turned broken machinery into working tools and scraps into something useful. That mindset had seemed out of place in the Army, where everything operated according to established procedures and approved equipment lists. But tonight, staring into darkness, so complete it felt solid, Kovacs found himself thinking about fences and wire and the elegant simplicity of a well-designed trap. The perimeter defenses at Firebase Delta were textbook standard, established according to field manual specifications that had been written by men who understood European warfare, but had never set foot in Pacific jungle. Sandbag bunkers anchored the corners, connected by shallow trenches that flooded every time it rained, which was approximately twice a day. Machine gun positions covered the obvious approaches, their fields of fire carefully plotted on maps that bore little resemblance to the actual terrain. Barbed wire obstacles ringed the position in 3 irregular lines, though the wire was already rusting in the humidity, and several sections had been knocked down by falling branches or pushed aside by the advancing jungle. Claymore mines guarded the main trails, positioned according to doctrine at precisely measured intervals. On paper, the defenses looked adequate. In reality, they were full of gaps that any competent enemy could exploit under cover of darkness. Kovacs had been studying those gaps for weeks, not out of any particular tactical genius, but simply because his life depended on them. He had watched how the Japanese operated, had listened to veterans describe their infiltration tactics, had examined the aftermath of attacks on other positions. The enemy specialized in patience and stealth, moving through jungle with supernatural quiet, exploiting every weakness in American defenses. They would probe a position for days, learning patrol patterns and timing, identifying blind spots and dead zones. Then, when conditions were perfect, they would strike with devastating speed and precision, often achieving complete surprise despite defenders being on full alert. Traditional defenses were designed to stop conventional assaults, mass attacks by visible enemies. They were far less effective against small teams of specialists who moved like ghosts and struck from unexpected angles. The problem kept Kovacs awake during his off-duty hours, gnawing at him with the persistence of mosquitoes that made sleep difficult anyway. The firebase was undermanned and undersupplied, lacking the resources for elaborate defensive improvements. They had only so many mines, so much wire, so many grenades to distribute. Every resource was precious, allocated according to plans made by officers who balanced competing needs across multiple positions. There was no spare equipment for experimentation, no surplus materials for unofficial projects. Everything had a designated purpose and an assigned location, tracked on inventory lists and accounted for in supply reports. Deviation from approved plans required authorization through channels that moved at bureaucratic speeds completely disconnected from tactical reality. By the time a request for defensive modifications worked its way through the system, the position might already be overrun. But Kovacs had grown up poor, had learned to work with scraps and cast-offs, to see potential in things other people threw away. And Firebase Delta, Like every military position, generated waste. Broken equipment awaited repair or disposal. Damaged material sat in piles behind the supply tent. Rusted wire from deteriorating obstacles lay coiled in corners, replaced by newer stocks but never actually removed. Spent ammunition crates, empty ration tins, worn-out tools, all the detritus of military operations accumulated in unofficial dumps at the position's edge. To the supply sergeant, it was junk awaiting proper disposal. To Kovacs, it was opportunity. He started small, experimenting during guard shifts when boredom made hours stretch like taffy. There were dozens of hand grenades at the firebase, standard issue fragmentation types that every man carried. They were reliable weapons, devastating in close quarters, but limited by the requirement that someone physically throw them. Maximum effective range was maybe 40 yards for a strong arm, less under stress or from awkward positions. But grenades did not have to be thrown. They could be placed, positioned, turned into something other than what doctrine intended. The mechanism was simple enough. A safety lever held down by a pin. Remove the pin while holding the lever. Then release the lever and the striker would hit the primer after a 4 to 5 second delay. Simple, predictable, and potentially adaptable. Kovacs retrieved a length of rusted fence wire from one of the junk piles, the kind of galvanized steel wire farmers use for cattle fencing back in Iowa. It was corroded from months of jungle humidity, the zinc coating flaking away to expose rough metal beneath, but it retained enough strength to support moderate tension. He also collected several empty ration cans, their contents long since consumed, the tins destined for burial or burning. Working in the dim light of a shielded lantern behind the supply tent, Kovacs began constructing something that existed nowhere in any Army field manual. He secured a grenade to a wooden stake driven into soft earth, positioning it upright with a safety lever facing the expected direction of enemy approach. Then he removed the safety pin, carefully maintaining pressure on the lever with a thin strip of metal cut from a ration tin. The strip acted as a substitute pin, but unlike the original, it required very little force to dislodge. Next came the trigger mechanism, crude but functional. Kovacs strung the rusted wire between two trees, positioning it approximately ankle height, exactly where a man moving carefully through darkness would not see it until too late. He ran a separate wire from this trip line to the metal strip holding the grenade safety lever, creating a connection that required precise tension. Too loose and nothing would happen. Too tight and the mechanism would trigger prematurely or fail completely. It took him 3 attempts to get the balance right, and even then he was not entirely confident. But the basic principle was sound. Anyone crossing the trip wire would pull the trigger line, which would dislodge the metal strip, which would release the grenade safety lever, which would initiate the 4-second countdown. By the time the victim realized what was happening, it would be far too late to react. Kovacs tested his creation the next morning, using a stick to simulate someone tripping the wire from a safe distance. The mechanism worked perfectly. The trip wire pulled the trigger line. The metal strip flew free. The safety lever popped off with its characteristic ping, and 4 seconds later the grenade detonated in a satisfying crack that sent shrapnel buzzing through the undergrowth. The explosion was not particularly large, but in a confined space between jungle trees, the fragmentation effect would be lethal to anyone within 15 feet and dangerous out to 30. Kovacs felt a surge of satisfaction, the same feeling he got back home when a repair he had improvised actually worked. This was not sophisticated engineering or brilliant tactical innovation. It was simply practical problem solving, using available materials to address an identified need. But as he stood looking at the scorched earth where the grenade had been, he realized he might have created something genuinely useful. He mentioned the trap to Corporal Henderson during their next guard shift, describing the mechanism in general terms. Henderson, a veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign, and therefore someone whose opinion carried weight, listened with growing interest. When Kovacs finished, Henderson was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he asked a question that would determine whether this was just an interesting experiment or something more. Could Kovacs build multiple traps? Could he create a network of them, covering the gaps in the perimeter defenses? And most importantly, could he do it without using resources allocated for other purposes? The answer to all 3 questions was yes. but it would require scrounging and improvisation on a scale that might attract unwanted attention. Every trap needed a grenade, and while the firebase had adequate stocks, removing them from official inventory would trigger questions. But there were always damaged grenades, ones that had been dropped or mishandled, that technically should be turned in for disposal, but often just sat in crates marked for eventual return to rear echelon supply points. There was rusted wire everywhere, salvaged from deteriorating obstacles or left over from construction projects. Stakes could be cut from jungle timber. Trigger mechanisms could be fashioned from scrap metal. Everything they needed existed at the firebase, not an official supply, but in the gray zone of military logistics, where broken and discarded items awaited proper disposal. Over the next week, working primarily during off-duty hours, Kovacs and Henderson constructed 17 tripwire traps. They positioned them carefully, studying the terrain around Firebase Delta, identifying the routes that enemy infiltrators would most likely use. The jungle was not uniformly passable. Thick vegetation, steep slopes, and water obstacles channeled movement into predictable corridors, and experienced soldiers learned to recognize these natural paths. The Japanese understood this as well, which meant they would use the same approach as Americans would choose in their position. Kovacs and Henderson focused on these likely avenues, placing their traps in areas that existing defenses did not adequately cover, creating overlapping kill zones that turned vulnerable gaps into lethal funnels. They used a rusted fence wired deliberately, choosing it over newer, stronger alternatives. The corrosion made the wire harder to see in low light, the rough surface not catching stray illumination the way clean metal would. It also gave the wire a texture that mimicked natural vines, making it blend into the jungle environment. To anyone moving cautiously through darkness, the trip wires would be nearly invisible, just another strand among thousands that crisscross a jungle at every height. The stakes holding the grenades were positioned behind trees or tucked into natural depressions, positioned so the explosions would direct shrapnel along the likely enemy approach routes. Each trap was tested carefully with stick triggers before being armed, and Henderson insisted on personally inspecting every single one to ensure the mechanisms were sound. They told no one else what they were doing. This was not out of deliberate secrecy, but simply because explaining would raise questions they did not want to answer. Where had the grenades come from? Who had authorized modifications to the defensive plan? Why were two enlisted men making tactical decisions above their pay grade? Better to simply build the traps, prove they worked if circumstances provided opportunity, and deal with any consequences later. It was the kind of logic that made perfect sense at private and corporal level, but would probably not survive contact with officer-level thinking. Lieutenant Morrison discovered the traps on October 18th, during a routine inspection of the perimeter defenses. He was new to the firebase, having arrived just 3 days earlier as a replacement for the previous platoon leader who had been evacuated with malaria. Morrison was fresh from officer candidate school, professionally trained and by-the-book competent, but he had never been in combat, and his understanding of jungle warfare came entirely from classroom instruction. He literally stumbled across one of Kovacs' traps, his boot snagging the tripwire during a walk through the defensive positions. Only Henderson's quick reflexes, grabbing the lieutenant and pulling him backward before the wire pulled taut enough to trigger the mechanism, prevented a catastrophic accident. What followed was one of the most uncomfortable conversations of Kovacs' military career. Morrison, shaken by how close he had come to triggering an explosive device at his own position, demanded to know who had constructed the trap, who had authorized it, and why he had not been informed. Kovacs explained as best he could, describing the defensive gaps, the infiltration threat, the improvised nature of the solution. He tried to emphasize the practical value, the way the traps covered areas that conventional defenses missed. But Morrison was not interested in tactical justification. He was interested in regulations, procedures, and the chain of command that Kovacs and Henderson had completely bypassed. The lieutenant's assessment was swift and uncompromising. The traps were unauthorized modifications to established defenses, constructed without approval using materials of questionable origin. They posed as much danger to friendly forces as to the enemy, as his own near miss demonstrated. Worse, they violated basic safety protocols, creating explosive hazards that were not marked or recorded on any defensive diagram. If someone was killed by one of these traps, whether enemy or friendly, the responsibility would fall on Morrison as platoon leader, and he was not willing to accept that liability. His order was clear and non-negotiable. Kovacs and Henderson would dismantle every single trap immediately, return any salvageable grenades to proper inventory, and never again modify defensive arrangements without explicit authorization through proper channels. Kovacs wanted to argue, wanted to point out that proper channels moved too slowly to address real threats, that improvisation was sometimes necessary, that the traps filled a genuine need. But he was a private addressing a lieutenant, and military hierarchy was not a democracy. He saluted, acknowledged the order, and spent the next 6 hours carefully disarming and dismantling 17 tripwire traps. Henderson worked beside him, equally frustrated but equally powerless. They salvaged the grenades, coiled the rusted wire, pulled the stakes. By evening, every trace of their work had been erased, and Firebase Delta's defenses were back to textbook standard, gaps and all. That night, Kovacs lay in his foxhole staring at darkness that felt more threatening than usual. The traps had given him a sense of control, a feeling that he was actively contributing to the Firebase's defense rather than just passively waiting for whatever might come. Now that sense was gone, replaced by the same helpless vulnerability he had felt during his first weeks in New Guinea. Morrison meant well. Kovacs understood that. The lieutenant was trying to enforce standards designed to prevent accidents and maintain order. But those standards had been written for different circumstances, and blindly applying them here felt like bringing a hammer to a problem that required a scalpel. The jungle did not care about regulations. The Japanese certainly did not. And men would die because someone decided that procedure mattered more than effectiveness. Henderson found him just after midnight, moving quietly through the darkness with the practiced stealth of someone who had survived multiple combat tours. The corporal crouched beside Kovacs' position, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about those traps," Henderson said, "about how Morrison called them unsafe and ridiculous." He paused, and Kovacs could hear frustration in that silence. "We've lost 4 men in the last month to enemy infiltrators. For good Marines who died because someone got through our defenses without being detected, but that's apparently less concerning than the theoretical risk of someone friendly triggering a marked trap." Kovacs said nothing, knowing Henderson was working through something. The corporal continued, "Morrison's never been in combat. He doesn't understand that perfect safety and effective defense are incompatible in a place like this. Every weapon we use is dangerous. Every mine we plant could potentially kill friendly forces. But we accept those risks because the alternative is worse." They talked for nearly an hour, voices low, discussing the impossible balance between following orders and surviving combat. Henderson eventually left, offering no solutions because none existed that did not involve insubordination. Kovacs returned to his watch, scanning darkness that revealed nothing, listening to jungle sounds that could mask an entire company. Somewhere out there, Japanese forces were planning their next move, identifying targets, preparing operations, and Firebase Delta would face them with defenses that looked good on paper, but had holes you could drive a truck through. October 21st dawned heavy with moisture, the sky pregnant with rain that would arrive by afternoon and turn the Firebase into a mud pit. Morning briefing brought troubling intelligence. Radio intercepts suggested increased enemy activity in the sector, and reconnaissance patrols had found signs of Japanese presence much closer to American positions than expected. A trail watcher station 3 miles north had reported observing what he believed was an enemy patrol moving south, toward Firebase Delta's location. The composition and strength were unknown, but the deliberate pace suggested reconnaissance rather than a simple transit. Someone was interested in the Firebase, and that interest was never good news. Lieutenant Morrison increased the alert status, doubled guard shifts, and ordered additional patrols to sweep the immediate perimeter. Everything by the book, textbook responses to a developing threat. But Kovacs, listening to the briefing, felt a cold certainty settling into his gut. They were going to be hit, and soon, and the defenses were inadequate. He found Henderson after the briefing, pulled him aside where their conversation would not be overheard. "We need to rebuild at least some of the traps," Kovacs said without preamble. Henderson's expression showed he had been thinking the same thing, but he shook his head. Morrison gave us a direct order. Disobeying would be court-martial territory. Kovacs understood the stakes, but he also understood something more fundamental. If we follow that order and men die because of gaps in our defenses, Morrison might face questions, might even face some administrative consequences. But we'll face caskets, Henderson. We'll face funerals and letters home to families. I'd rather risk court-martial than risk that. The corporal studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. We do this, we do it smart. Minimum number of traps. Position only in the most critical gaps. We don't tell anyone, not even the other men. And if Morrison finds out, you let me take the fall. I've got more time in service, more credibility. Might survive the consequences better than a private. They worked through the afternoon, moving during the heaviest rainfall when visibility dropped to near zero, and everyone else was sheltering in cover positions. They rebuilt 5 traps, focusing on the northern and western approaches where the suspected enemy patrol would most likely strike. The same rusted fence wire, the same improvised triggers, the same careful positioning in natural choke points. They worked quickly but precisely, muscle memory from the previous construction making the process faster. By evening, when the rain finally eased and visibility improved, 5 tripwire traps were in place, armed and waiting. Their existence known only to 2 men who had decided that effectiveness mattered more than orders. That night, firebase held a button up tight. Guard posts were fully manned, weapons loaded, everyone on edge with the knowledge that enemy forces were prowling nearby. Morrison conducted multiple inspections, checking positions, verifying field of fire, ensuring everything met standard protocols. He never ventured to the specific areas where Kovacs and Henderson had rebuilt their traps. Pure luck that kept the secret intact. Midnight came and went, the witching hour when most attacks occurred. But nothing happened. 100 hours passed, then 200. Tension gradually easing as men began to hope they might make it through another night unmolested. Kovacs, on guard in the northern perimeter, knew better. The Japanese were patient. They would strike when conditions were perfect, not according to American expectations of timing. At 0247 hours, the jungle exploded. The first detonation came from the western approach, a sharp crack that sent birds screaming into the night sky and brought every man at Firebase Delta to full alert. Before the echo faded, 2 more explosions followed in rapid succession from the same general area, creating a staccato rhythm of violence that lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then silence crashed back down, absolute and somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. Kovacs was already moving, Henderson beside him, both men racing toward the sound while everyone else was still processing what had happened. They covered the distance in under a minute, crashing through undergrowth with complete disregard for stealth, because stealth no longer mattered. They found the kill zone lit by Morrison's flashlight, the lieutenant having arrived seconds before them with a fire team. The scene was carnage compressed into a space barely 20 feet across. Bodies lay scattered in grotesque positions, some intact, but most showing the devastating effects of fragmentation, grenades at close range. Kovacs counted quickly, his mind cataloging even as his stomach churned. 12 bodies, all wearing Japanese uniforms, all equipped with a light gear typical of infiltration specialists. They had been moving in single file along a natural path between 2 massive trees, exactly where Kovacs had predicted enemy forces would approach. The first man had triggered the initial trap, the explosion killing him instantly and wounding several others behind him. In their confusion and pain, survivors had stumbled in different directions, triggering 2 additional traps that completed the devastation. From first detonation to last had been perhaps 30 seconds. The entire enemy patrol had been wiped out before they could fire a single shot, before they could even fully comprehend what was happening. Morrison stood frozen, his flashlight beam playing across the scene, his expression cycling through shock and confusion toward a terrible understanding. He turned slowly, the light finding Kovacs and Henderson standing at the edge of the kill zone. No words were necessary. The lieutenant knew, instantly and completely, what had happened and who was responsible. For a long moment, the 3 men simply stared at each other across 12 corpses, the evidence of both success and insubordination impossible to ignore. Then Morrison did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He switched off the flashlight, plunging them back into darkness. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral, the tone of a man making calculations in real time. "I want a detailed search of all these bodies," Morrison said, addressing the fire team that had accompanied him. "Document everything. Collect intelligence materials, catalog weapons and equipment. This appears to be an elite infiltration unit, which means they were probably gathering information for a larger assault." He paused, then continued with the same neutral tone. "Someone will need to map where these defensive positions were located, so we can incorporate them into our official defensive diagram. Corporal Henderson, you'll handle that, since you seem familiar with the area." The implication was clear, the unspoken bargain obvious. Morrison would not ask questions about how the traps came to be there. He would not investigate who had disobeyed his direct order. But in exchange, this would become official, documented, part of the firebase's authorized defenses going forward. The search of the bodies yielded intelligence that justified every risk Kovacs and Henderson had taken. The Japanese patrol had been a reconnaissance element from a full company position less than 2 miles away, preparing for a major assault on Firebase Delta scheduled the following night. They carried detailed sketches of the American position, notes on guard rotations and defensive gaps, plans for simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. They had been operating in the area for at least a week, gathering information, preparing the ground. Their mission tonight had been a final close reconnaissance before the main assault, checking for any last-minute changes to American dispositions. Instead, they had walked into traps that should not have existed, and their deaths had provided warning that probably saved every American life at Firebase Delta. By dawn, the firebase was a hive of purposeful activity. Morrison had radioed for reinforcements and artillery support, using the captured intelligence to justify an immediate response. Additional troops arrived by mid-morning, doubling the garrison's strength. Forward observers coordinated fire missions on the suspected enemy assembly area, raining high-explosive shells into jungle that erupted with secondary explosions suggesting ammunition stockpiles. Patrols probed outward, finding abandoned equipment and positions indicating a hasty Japanese withdrawal. The planned assault never materialized, the enemy company dispersing rather than attacking an alerted and reinforced position. Kovacs' improvised traps had not just stopped one patrol. They had disrupted an entire operation, prevented what could have been a catastrophic battle. Lieutenant Morrison called Kovacs and Henderson to his command post that afternoon. The 3 men stood in an awkward triangle, aware that this conversation would define future relationships and possibly future careers. Morrison spoke first, his words careful and precise. "What you two did was insubordinate, dangerous, and completely outside proper channels. By every regulation, I should bring charges and let a court-martial sort out." He paused, and Kovacs prepared himself for the consequences he had known were coming. But Morrison continued, his tone shifting slightly. "However, what you did also saved lives, provided critical warning of enemy intentions, and demonstrated tactical initiative that goes beyond what we typically expect from enlisted personnel. So here's what's going to happen. Officially, those traps were part of approved defensive improvements constructed under my authorization as platoon leader. The timeline is fuzzy, documentation is spotty, but that's the story, and everyone sticks to it." The lieutenant pulled out a hand-drawn map, spreading it across his field desk. "Unofficially, you're going to teach me and every other man at this fire base how to build those traps properly. We're going to establish a formal program with safety protocols and clear marking systems so friendly forces don't wander into them. We're going to document the designs, write up the effectiveness data, and send up the chain as a proposed defensive innovation. Maybe it gets adopted more widely, maybe it gets buried by bureaucracy, but either way, we're going to do this right." Morrison looked at both men directly. "You were correct that our standard defenses had gaps. You were incorrect to address those gaps through insubordination. But the result speaks for itself, so we're going to find a way to make this work within the system rather than outside it." Over the next week, Kovacs became an unlikely instructor, teaching 24 Marines the principles of improvised trap construction. They refined the designs, improving trigger mechanisms, developing better camouflage techniques, establishing safety protocols that reduce friendly fire risks. The rusted fence wire became a deliberate choice rather than necessity, its corroded appearance providing superior concealment compared to newer materials. They experimented with different configurations, testing various approaches to maximize effectiveness while minimizing the danger to American forces. Lieutenant Morrison documented everything, building a comprehensive report that included technical specifications, tactical applications, and statistical data on the trap's combat effectiveness. The report worked its way up the chain of command with surprising speed, helped along by the undeniable fact that a single firebase had detected and destroyed an enemy infiltration patrol while preventing a larger attack. Battalion forwarded it to Regiment with a strong endorsement. Regiment sent it to Division with additional commentary about the need for flexible defensive solutions in jungle warfare. By late November, Kovacs found himself summoned to Division headquarters, where a full colonel wanted to discuss the traps in detail. The meeting was surreal, a 19-year-old private explaining improvised weapons designed to officers who commanded thousands of men. But the colonel listened intently, asked sharp questions, and ultimately authorized production of official field manuals documenting the trap designs. The impact spread beyond New Guinea. Copies of the manual reached other theaters, where soldiers facing similar challenges adapted the designs to their specific circumstances. In the Philippines, Marines used variations of Kovacs' traps to defend isolated positions against Japanese infiltrators. In Burma, Army units employed them to protect supply routes through hostile territory. The basic principle proved universally applicable. Simple, improvised offenses using locally available materials could effectively counter sophisticated enemy tactics when properly designed and positioned. The rusted fence wire became almost iconic, a symbol of practical innovation triumphing over rigid doctrine. Supply sergeants started requisitioning corroded wire specifically for trap construction, deliberately choosing inferior materials because they worked better than pristine alternatives. Kovacs survived the war, carried his knowledge through subsequent campaigns in the Philippines and eventually Okinawa. He witnessed the traps evolve and improve, saw them integrated into official doctrine, watched as something he had built from scraps and frustration became standard operating procedure across the Pacific Theater. The fame never sat comfortably with him. He had not been trying to innovate or revolutionize defensive tactics. He had simply been trying to fix a problem that was getting people killed, using the only resources available and the practical skills his father had taught him on an Iowa farm. The fact that military bureaucracy eventually caught up and legitimized the solution was almost beside the point. Lieutenant Morrison's career took an unexpected turn as well. His decision to support Kovacs rather than punish him, to find a way to work within the system while acknowledging its limitations, earned him a reputation as a pragmatic leader who cared more about effectiveness than procedure. He rose steadily through the ranks, eventually retiring as a colonel with a Distinguished Service Cross and a reputation for tactical flexibility. In his memoirs, published decades after the war, Morrison devoted an entire chapter to the night Firebase Delta's defenses stopped a 12-man patrol in 30 seconds. He was honest about his initial reaction, his by-the-book instinct to shut down anything that deviated from approved methods. But he was equally honest about what combat had taught him, that regulations were tools, not sacred texts, and that sometimes the best solutions came from desperate men with practical skills rather than from headquarters with proper plans. The firebase itself faded into history, eventually abandoned as the war moved beyond New Guinea toward the Philippines and Japan itself. The jungle reclaimed the position within months, vegetation swallowing trenches and bunkers until no trace remained of the small outposts where Americans had lived and fought. But the lessons learned there persisted, encoded in field manuals and training programs, passed down through generations of soldiers who never knew Kovacs' name but benefited from his innovation. The concept of improvised defensive traps became standard curriculum at infantry schools, taught to new soldiers as established doctrine rather than desperate improvisation. Kovacs himself rarely discussed his wartime experiences after returning home. He went back to Iowa, took over his father's farm, lived a quiet life that bore no outward resemblance to the violence he had survived. Neighbors knew he was a veteran, knew he had been decorated, but most had no idea what he had actually done or how many lives his innovations had saved. On the rare occasions when other veterans sought him out, usually researchers or historians working on Pacific War projects. Kovacs would answer questions with characteristic modesty. He always emphasized that the traps were not genius, just common sense applied to an immediate problem. He always credited Henderson with equal contributions, though the corporal had died on Okinawa and could not speak for himself. And he always expressed ambivalence about the necessity of the innovation, wishing the war had never required such solutions in the first place. But there was one story Kovacs told consistently, usually late in conversations when his natural reticence had been worn down by persistence or alcohol. It was about the morning after the Japanese patrol was destroyed, when dawn revealed the full extent of the kill zone. Morrison had ordered the bodies searched and documented, standard procedure for gathering intelligence. But before the work parties arrived, Kovacs had stood alone among the carnage, looking at 12 men who had died in explosive violence, some of them barely older than himself. They were enemy soldiers, would have killed every American at Firebase Delta if given the chance. But they were also human beings who had mothers and fathers, perhaps siblings or wives or children. They had been doing their duty as they understood it, following orders, trying to survive a war they did not start. And they had died because Kovacs had been clever with rusted wire and discarded grenades. The weight of that realization never entirely left him. Every time someone praised his innovation, every time he saw references to his traps in military publications, Kovacs remembered those 12 bodies and the knowledge that violence, even necessary and justified violence, always carried a cost. His traps had saved American lives, had proven effective beyond anyone's initial expectations, had influenced offensive doctrine across an entire theater of war. But they had accomplished this by killing efficiently, by turning jungle trails into slaughterhouses, by mechanizing death in a way that required no human decision at the moment of execution. The traps were triggered by simple physics, wire tension and lever release, indifferent to whether the victim was enemy soldier or law civilian or careless friendly. That moral ambiguity haunted him, the understanding that effective weapons and ethical weapons were not always the same thing. Years later, speaking at a small veterans gathering in Des Moines, Kovacs was asked what advice he would give young soldiers facing similar circumstances, situations where doctrine seemed inadequate and improvisation appeared necessary. His answer surprised many who expected him to advocate for innovation and creative thinking. Instead, Kovacs emphasized the importance of moral calculation, of understanding that every tactical decision carried ethical weight. Yes, think creatively, he said. Yes, use the resources available. Yes, challenge doctrine when reality demands it. But never forget that every weapon you create, every trap you build, every system you design exists to kill human beings. That should never become routine, never become just an engineering problem to solve. The moment we stop feeling the weight of that responsibility is the moment we lose something essential about our humanity. The Firebase Delta traps represented both the best and worst of wartime innovation. They were effective, saving lives and accomplishing military objectives with remarkable efficiency. They were practical, using scrap materials and simple physics to solve complex tactical problems. They were adaptable, proving useful across multiple theaters and circumstances. But they were also grim reminders of warfare's fundamental brutality, of the human cost that underlies every tactical success, of the moral compromises that survival sometimes demands. Kovacs never resolved that tension, never found a way to feel entirely comfortable with his wartime contributions. He had done what circumstances required, had acted based on the best information and judgment available, had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. But he also understood that those accomplishments came at a price measured in bodies and blood, and the knowledge that his cleverness had made killing more efficient. Firebase Delta's legacy lived on in field manuals and training programs, in the soldiers who learned from Kovacs' innovations without knowing his name, in the defensive tactics that became standard practice throughout modern military operations. The rusted fence wire traps proved that effective solutions sometimes came from unexpected sources, that enlisted men with practical skills could revolutionize tactics, that necessity could drive innovation faster than any formal research program. But the legacy also served as a reminder that military effectiveness and moral certainty were not always aligned, that winning battles and preserving humanity required constant vigilance and uncomfortable self-examination. Kovacs carried both parts of that legacy until his death in 1987, proud of what it had accomplished, but never entirely at peace with what it had required.